They thought firing me with a 3-minute phone call would secure their $500 million merger. They were completely wrong. I did not cry or beg. I simply smiled and walked away. The most ruthless revenge is not starting a fire. It is patiently watching your enemies lock themselves inside a gas-filled room, right before you light the match. How this empire of lies gets crushed at the final hour will absolutely give you chills. Hello to our wonderful audience at Boss Revenge Stories, and thank you sincerely for your continuous support. Sadly, our channel has been demonetized by YouTube, leaving us with absolutely no operating budget, meaning we are forced to cease operations on this platform and will no longer be releasing new public videos. If you find today's story captivating, please support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel through the QR code on your screen or the link in the video description and pinned comment, where you will unlock access to even better, longer, and incredibly detailed exclusive true stories featuring multiple highly emotional voiceovers that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. Let us begin today's story. My name is Cassidy Barnes, and this is exactly how I orchestrated the total collapse of a fraudulent empire. The digital chime of the company messaging application shattered the absolute silence of my office. The clock on my desktop monitor displayed 4:30 in the afternoon on a Friday. Most people in Austin, Texas were already thinking about their weekend plans, but inside the sterile, glass-enclosed walls of Ethelgard Biosciences, time moved completely differently. I am 34 years old, and until that exact moment, I was serving as the head of algorithmic risk control. The sudden message was a calendar invite for an immediate, mandatory video conference with executive leadership. When I clicked the link to join the virtual room, two faces immediately filled my screen. First was Julian Vance, our chief executive officer, wearing his trademark gray cashmere turtleneck. He loved to dress like a modern technological visionary and spent most of his public appearances passionately preaching the gospel of humanitarian medicine. Next to him sat Marcus Thorne, the director of research and development, who could not quite hide the nervous, erratic twitch near his left eye. Julian cleared his throat, adopting his absolute best tone of forced corporate empathy. He deliberately adjusted his sleeves, making sure his ridiculously expensive watch caught the camera light. "Cassidy, we are making some difficult organizational shifts. The board of directors has been thoroughly evaluating our financial trajectory, and due to cash flow optimization restructuring, we unfortunately have to eliminate your position, effective immediately. We deeply appreciate your significant contributions to the company." It was a beautifully sanitized, carefully rehearsed corporate lie, delivered with the practiced ease of a man who sold snake oil to venture capitalists for a living. I knew the exact reason my head was currently on the chopping block, and it had absolutely nothing to do with cash flow or optimization. That very morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, I had categorically refused to sign the final safety approval report for our flagship software product, the Core Hematology Diagnostic Artificial Intelligence System. During my final algorithmic risk assessment, I had uncovered a deeply buried, fatal anomaly. Marcus had intentionally tweaked the machine learning model to deliberately ignore critical early warning signs of severe multiple organ failure. He engineered this terrifying technological shortcut to artificially inflate our clinical trial success metrics and dramatically accelerate the federal licensing timeline. Approving that fraudulent code meant putting thousands of real human lives in grave danger, just so these two men could hit a lucrative deployment deadline and secure their massive acquisition payout. They fully expected a chaotic, highly emotional reaction. They braced themselves for me to lose my temper, slam my fists on the desk, scream about wrongful termination, or threaten them with massive corporate whistleblowing lawsuits. Julian was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, perfectly ready to calmly deploy his aggressive legal defense script regarding strict non-disclosure agreements. Marcus was sweating visibly, terrified and waiting for the righteous, uncontrollable anger of a betrayed ethical engineer. I gave them absolutely nothing. No anger, no tears, no raised voice. I looked straight into the lens of the webcam, keeping my facial expression completely neutral. and allowed a soft, highly polite smile to touch my lips. "I understand completely," I said, ensuring my voice remained remarkably steady, soft, and unnervingly calm. "I wish you both the very best of luck with the future of Ethelgard Biosciences." Before either of them could process my total lack of resistance or formulate any kind of follow-up response, I moved my mouse and deliberately clicked the red button to end the connection. I walked away from them before their human resources department could even finish reading their carefully drafted termination script. I knew exactly how modern corporate technology terminations worked. I had exactly 15 minutes before the system administrators would remotely revoke my network access, lock my administrative terminal, and permanently wipe my security credentials. 15 minutes is practically a lifetime if you know exactly where the digital bodies are buried and how to manipulate the soil. I did not panic, nor did I rush. My hands hovered over the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking echoing sharply in my empty, brilliantly lit office. I did not delete a single file. Deletion is incredibly amateurish. It immediately screams sabotage, sets off internal security alarms, and invites immediate forensic investigation by outside consultants. Instead, I operated completely within my authorized administrative clearance, moving like an absolute ghost through the complex server architecture. I precisely located the entire repository of the failed internal audit logs. These were the exact, unmodified files proving the artificial intelligence willfully ignored the organ failure markers, residing directly alongside the undeniable digital footprints of Marcus manually overriding my safety protocols. With precise, unhurried keystrokes, I quietly altered the routing codes of those specific, highly incriminating records. I systematically migrated the entire damning history into a hidden master metadata folder deeply embedded within the core system architecture. This was not just a simple hidden file directory. I deliberately anchored it under a specific security classification protected by strict federal cybersecurity data preservation laws. If anyone in the information technology department, including Marcus himself, tried to forcefully scrub, alter, or manipulate that specific metadata, the system would instantly and automatically trigger a permanent, undeletable violation flag across the entire global server network. They were now permanently locked inside a digital cage they did not even realize existed. As the clock ticked down to my absolute final minute, my dual monitors suddenly flashed gray. A small notification window appeared in the dead center. Access denied. Account locked. I calmly stood up, grabbed my tailored black blazer from the back of my chair, and picked up a heavy silver object from my bottom desk drawer. It was a high-grade, hardware-encrypted flash drive. I walked out of my office and moved slowly down the pristine white hallway toward the independent legal secretary department. The junior clerk on duty barely looked up from her phone as I approached the highly secure, heavily monitored drop box. I slipped the heavy metal drive into the impenetrable corporate safe. Printed clearly on the pristine white label securely attached to the device were very specific instructions. It read, "Backup source code. Only open upon third-party merger due diligence request." I pushed the heavy glass doors of the main lobby open and stepped out into the blazing Texas heat. The afternoon air was thick and suffocating, but I took a deep, incredibly refreshing breath. I was entirely unemployed, stripped of my corporate title, and permanently locked out of my life's work. Yet I had never felt more absolutely in control. The invisible blade was firmly planted in their backs, and all I had to do now was patiently wait for them to bleed out. The moment the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung shut behind me, I knew exactly what was unfolding on the top floor of the building I had just exited. I could vividly picture Julian eagerly popping the cork on an absurdly expensive bottle of vintage champagne in his pristine corner office, pouring a generous glass for a deeply relieved Marcus. They were undoubtedly toasting to their own perceived brilliance, entirely convinced they had surgically removed the single ethical obstacle standing between them and a $500 million acquisition by Vanguard Health. They truly believed they had won the ultimate prize. They believed the quiet exit I gave them was the pathetic sound of my complete and utter defeat. I did not linger in Texas long enough to witness their victory lap. within exactly 2 weeks of my termination. I had completely packed up my entire life and relocated to a remarkably secluded wooden cabin nestled deep within the snow-covered mountains of Colorado. I gladly traded the suffocating, hyper-competitive atmosphere of the Austin technology sector for the biting, crisp air of high altitudes and endless, isolating pine forests. I intentionally and ruthlessly severed absolutely every single connection I possessed to my former professional network. I quietly registered a small, independent algorithmic consulting firm under a deliberately generic name, taking on just enough low-profile clients to keep my analytical mind sharp and my utility bills paid. My new life was intentionally slow, wonderfully quiet, and entirely detached from the frantic, greed-fueled race for venture capital funding. Meanwhile, back in the aggressively air-conditioned, deeply sanitized server rooms of my former employer, their information technology department was frantically working overtime to completely erase my digital existence. They aggressively purged my entire internal email history, permanently and physically reformatted the hard drives of my dedicated workstation, and completely revoked my legacy access tokens across all platforms. Marcus, feeling newly emboldened by my perfectly quiet departure, personally oversaw the creation of a massive, highly complex volume of entirely fabricated safety reports. He spent countless late nights locked in his office, meticulously crafting fake clinical trial data to successfully mask the fatal, undeniable flaws within the diagnostic artificial intelligence algorithm. What Marcus fundamentally failed to understand was that wiping a local hard drive is exactly like sweeping dirt off a front porch, while the structural foundation of the entire house is quietly collapsing into a sinkhole. He had absolutely no idea that the specific metadata structure I had carefully established during my final 15 minutes had already seamlessly woven itself directly into the absolute core root code of the entire medical system. It was a perfectly engineered digital ghost, completely undetectable to their standard internal security sweeps and conventional antivirus protocols. Because of the meticulous precision of the system I had engineered, each instance where Marcus used his executive administrative access to override patient safety protocols yielded an unexpected result. Rather than executing his commands, the network discreetly flagged his fraudulent interventions as an active cyber attack. Every falsified entry he produced, and every vital safety alert he intentionally bypassed, was immediately timestamped, archived, and isolated within the encrypted master directory I had established. Marcus was not erasing his tracks. With every desperate keystroke, he was systematically constructing an airtight case against himself, flawlessly recording his extensive corporate malpractice in real time. A few weeks after my quiet relocation to the mountains, a small, heavily wrinkled envelope arrived in my rusted metal mailbox at the very end of the mountain road. Inside was a remarkably cheap severance check from Ethelgard Biosciences, representing a final, highly insulting attempt to buy my permanent silence. The dollar amount was pitifully small, mathematically calculated down to the exact final hour of my employment. I did not take the paper to the local bank to cash it. Instead, I purchased a simple, elegant black frame, carefully placed the check inside, and hung it squarely in the middle of my wooden living room wall. To anyone else visiting my home, it would simply look like a strange, incomprehensible piece of modern art. To me, it was a highly precise countdown clock ticking down to their absolute, inevitable destruction. As the deep winter snow began to heavily blanket the surrounding mountains, the global financial world began to lose its collective mind over the upcoming corporate merger. The financial television news channels and major print publications like Bloomberg were entirely saturated with glowing, highly optimistic reports about Vanguard Health preparing to finalize the massive $500 million buyout within the coming weeks. Julian Vance was absolutely everywhere. He became the polished, confidently smiling cover face of 3 different major business magazines in a single month, being widely hailed by journalists as a revolutionary pioneer in the complex field of humanitarian medical technology. He was greedily soaking in the massive adoration of the entire industry, blissfully sleepwalking toward the jagged edge of a massive cliff. Entirely unaware that the solid ground beneath his expensive leather shoes had already turned to absolute dust. Exactly 6 months drifted by, and the highly exhausting, incredibly demanding due diligence process initiated by Vanguard Health finally entered its absolute final week. In the hyperinflated, reality-detached ecosystem of modern technology startups, surviving due diligence is usually a time for quiet, anxious relief, but for the severely arrogant leadership team at Ethelgard, it was merely an excuse for a deeply premature, incredibly lavish coronation ceremony. They hosted an outrageously expensive, heavily catered celebration event right in the middle of their massive central atrium. The casual ping-pong tables and beanbag chairs were unceremoniously shoved aside to make room for towering crystal champagne fountains. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos carried heavy silver trays loaded with imported caviar and wildly expensive, rare vintages, weaving smoothly through gigantic ice sculptures intricately carved into the shape of medical crosses. It was a perfectly disgusting, wildly tone-deaf display of unearned hubris. They were eagerly throwing a massive party to celebrate a staggering $500 million victory before the final legal contracts were even printed, let alone signed by the relevant regulatory authorities. The only person in the entire building absolutely immune to this intoxicating, blinding atmosphere of artificial triumph was Elena Rostova. As the notoriously ruthless, completely uncompromising head of auditing for Vanguard Health, she commanded her elite delegation of forensic accountants and highly specialized software inspectors with the terrifying, cold precision of a decorated military general. She wore a sharply tailored, impeccably pressed charcoal suit and possessed a gaze so intensely penetrating it felt like it could instantly freeze boiling water. Elena did not care about the melting ice sculptures, the fake smiles, or the ridiculously expensive catering. She cared strictly and exclusively about raw, unfiltered, verifiable data. When she finally marched her disciplined team away from the noisy party and into the primary, glass-enclosed executive conference room to execute the absolute final algorithmic review, the ambient temperature in the office seemed to immediately drop 10 degrees. Marcus stood confidently at the head of the massive mahogany conference table, practically vibrating with an entirely unearned sense of superiority. He deliberately wiped his slightly damp palms on his designer trousers, puffed out his chest, and formally handed Elena a highly secure digital token. This small device granted her proprietary diagnostic software complete, unrestricted deep crawl access directly into the darkest depths of the Ethelgard Central Data Warehouse. Marcus was entirely convinced that his frantic, desperate months of late-night coding, aggressive data scrubbing, and generating tens of thousands of fabricated clinical reports had successfully sterilized the entire network. He genuinely believed that his freshly whitewashed, highly manipulated algorithms would easily blind the sophisticated, multi-million-dollar scanning software deployed by the massive healthcare conglomerate. He offered Elena a sickeningly sweet, overly familiar smile as she wordlessly inserted the physical token into her heavily encrypted, military-grade laptop. More than 1,000 miles away, high up in the quiet, deeply frozen, snow-draped elevations of the Colorado mountains, my heavily encrypted secondary mobile phone buzzed exactly once on my reclaimed wood kitchen counter. I walked over slowly and gently tapped the dark screen to illuminate the display. A stark, automated, entirely anonymous text message glowed brightly in the dim, natural light of my rustic cabin. It contained only 5 incredibly satisfying words. Peripheral audit protocol strictly activated. A deep, genuine sense of absolute, unshakable peace washed completely over me. I did not rush to open a laptop. I did not frantically check any secondary command monitors or attempt to access the remote servers. I simply smiled to myself, turned my back to the technology, walked over to my vintage cast iron stove, and began calmly brewing a steaming hot cup of fragrant jasmine tea, while the heavy winter snow fell softly and silently outside my large window. The invisible trap was officially sprung, and there was absolutely no turning back for any of them now. Back in the chaotic, incredibly loud corporate atrium in Texas, Julian was far too busy commanding the undivided attention of everyone present to notice any impending doom. He stood elevated on a small temporary stage, gripping a wireless microphone tightly, his face flushed red with the deep, intoxicating thrill of his own perceived genius. He boldly and loudly boasted to the large crowd of gathered investors, easily manipulated journalists, and heavily intoxicated software engineers that their revolutionary artificial intelligence system was flawlessly, unequivocally, perfect, he proudly declared, his voice echoing off the glass walls, that their proprietary medical code was so incredibly clean, so beautifully and ethically engineered, that they had not registered a single solitary internal risk warning in over 12 straight months. It was a spectacular, monumental, incredibly dangerous lie, delivered with the absolute, unwavering conviction of a man who firmly believed he had successfully cheated the universe and permanently secured his fortune. However, the very foundation of Julian's staggering overconfidence began to violently fracture and break apart inside the sterile executive conference room just a few yards away. Elena sat perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of pure concentration, as her proprietary auditing software aggressively chewed its way through the complex Ethelgard core architecture. The system was actively projecting the live, highly detailed diagnostic results directly onto the massive screen occupying the entire center wall of the room. For several long, agonizing minutes, everything was running perfectly smoothly, rapidly displaying endless lines of comforting green approval codes. Marcus was literally sighing in physical relief. But then, without any prior warning whatsoever, the sophisticated scanning protocol violently collided with an impenetrable, entirely unexpected digital wall hidden deep within the primary infrastructure. The quiet, rhythmic hum of the server cooling fans seemed to entirely vanish as the enormous projection screen abruptly flashed a glaring, terrifyingly bright, inescapable blood red. A massive, undeniable error message completely overtook the entire display, casting a harsh crimson glow over the shocked faces of the executives. The Vanguard Health Auditing System had completely and forcefully halted its final review. It tightly locked down the entire network grid and began loudly, relentlessly demanding the immediate insertion of a highly specific physical decryption key to proceed any further. The harsh, glaring crimson light from the massive projection screen bathed the entire executive conference room in the color of an absolute, inescapable emergency. The flawless, $500 million facade had just cracked completely wide open, and the silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man's lungs. Elena Rostova did not flinch, nor did she express a single ounce of surprise. She simply leaned forward in her expensive leather chair, her piercing eyes scanning the rapidly cascading lines of system diagnostic reports that were forcibly replacing the fake safety data Marcus had spent months fabricating. The Vanguard Health proprietary auditing software had violently rejected the manipulated algorithms. It translated the massive digital blockage into a stark, undeniable security warning that was now broadcasted for every executive in the room to witness. The screen generated a massive text block detailing that the deep crawl inspection had forcefully collided with a highly sophisticated, impenetrable firewall. This specific barrier was explicitly designed to quarantine severe, Level 1 medical ethics violation files. Right beneath that terrifying classification, the system proudly displayed the undeniable digital signature of the encryption architect in bold, stark white lettering. It read, Cassidy Barnes. Marcus physically recoiled from the projection screen as if he had just been violently struck by a bolt of lightning. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifyingly pale shade of gray. He started stammering uncontrollably, desperately trying to formulate a coherent excuse, but his throat had completely seized up in absolute terror. Elena slowly turned her head, fixing Marcus with a stare that could effortlessly cut through solid steel armor. She did not ask a polite question, Nor did she request an explanation for the glaring anomaly. She issued a direct, uncompromising command with the authority of an executioner. The system's security log clearly indicates that a required physical decryption key was securely deposited on site, she stated, her voice entirely devoid of any recognizable human warmth or empathy. The log explicitly points to the independent legal secretary drop safe. Bring that physical key to me right this exact second. Julian, who had just strutted confidently into the back of the conference room holding his half-empty crystal glass of vintage champagne, stopped absolutely dead in his tracks. The delicate glass slipped effortlessly from his suddenly numb fingers, shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces against the highly polished hardwood floor. The loud, violent crash of the crystal was entirely ignored by everyone in the room. The horrifying, inescapable realization hit Julian with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. The heavy silver flash drive that I had so calmly and politely dropped off all those months ago was not the pathetic, meaningless parting gesture of a defeated, broken employee. It was a live, highly complex, ticking digital bomb that I had deliberately planted directly into the foundational pillars of his fraudulent empire. Pure, unadulterated panic completely overrode Julian's carefully cultivated facade of visionary leadership. He spun around wildly and sprinted out of the conference room, instantly abandoning all pretense of executive dignity and control. He desperately sprinted down the pristine, aggressively sanitized white corridors of his own company, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically on the polished tiles. His highly customized designer cashmere turtleneck was suddenly completely soaked in cold, terrified sweat. He knew he absolutely had to reach the legal department first. He had to physically destroy that specific metal drive before the Vanguard health auditors could ever plug it into their network and unleash the horrifying truth. He violently burst through the heavy glass doors of the legal suite, aggressively startling the junior administrative clerk who was quietly working at her desk. "Open the master drop safe," Julian screamed, his voice cracking violently with sheer, unhinged desperation. "Open it right this exact second, or I will fire you on the spot." The terrified clerk practically fell out of her chair, fumbling wildly with the complex combination dials and the biometric thumbprint scanners. After what felt like an absolute eternity to the panicking executive, the heavy steel door finally clicked open with a deep, mechanical thud. Julian violently shoved the young woman aside, plunging his shaking hands directly into the dark cavity of the safe to retrieve the silver flash drive. He spun around and grabbed a heavy, solid brass paperweight from the nearest administrative desk. He forcefully placed the tiny silver drive onto the hard concrete floor, raising the heavy brass weight high above his head with both hands, fully intending to smash the tiny metal casing into unrecognizable, utterly useless electronic dust. But right before he could bring the crushing weight down, the entire building fundamentally and violently changed its atmosphere. The centralized ambient lighting system immediately severed the standard, comforting white glow, plunging the entire floor into emergency power mode. Bright, aggressive red strobe lights began flashing furiously from the ceiling fixtures, casting menacing shadows across the walls. A computerized, highly automated voice echoed incredibly loudly through the entire public address system of the facility, drowning out the distant music from the premature celebration in the atrium. "Warning," the artificial voice announced, devoid of any emotion. "Unauthorized physical tampering detected on the master decryption key. Dead man switch protocol permanently activated." Julian froze instantly, his arms still raised high in the air holding the heavy brass weight, pure terror entirely paralyzing his muscles. The automated voice continued its relentless, highly public broadcast across every speaker in the building. "If the physical drive is destroyed, compromised, or removed from the premises without the proper external auditing sequence initiated by authorized third-party software, the entire core algorithmic source code will initiate an immediate, permanent, and entirely unrecoverable deletion sequence to protect patient data integrity." The brutal genius of the trap finally dawned on him. Julian realized he was entirely cornered in a nightmare of his own making. If he destroyed the drive right then and there, the entire software product valued at $500 million would instantly vanish into thin air, leaving Ethelgard completely bankrupt and leaving him completely vulnerable to massive investor lawsuits for losing their core asset. But if he allowed Elena to plug it in, she would instantly uncover the massive, undeniable fraud, leading directly to federal prison for him and his entire executive team. He slowly lowered the heavy brass weight, falling to his knees on the carpet, clutching his chest desperately as he began to hyperventilate. Back near the conference room, the blaring, inescapable alarms had driven Marcus into a state of absolute, frantic hysteria. He sprinted out into the hallway, pulling his mobile phone from his pocket with violently shaking, uncoordinated fingers. He scrolled wildly through his contacts and hit the call button for my specific number. He paced back and forth against the glass walls like a caged, rabid animal. "Cassidy, please pick up." He whimpered pitifully into the voicemail system, actual tears streaming rapidly down his face, completely ruining his professional appearance. "Please, I know you can hear me. We need the manual override password right now. I will personally transfer $10 million into any offshore account you want within the hour. Just tell me the access code. Please, Cassidy, I am begging you for my life." He hung up immediately and dialed again, over and over and over, leaving dozens of increasingly pathetic, high-pitched audio messages that echoed with absolute defeat. All he received in return was the endless, agonizingly long beep of the automated voicemail prompt. I did not hear a single second of his desperate, humiliating groveling. I was hundreds of miles away, completely surrounded by a towering, majestic forest of ancient pine trees. I was heavily bundled in a thick winter coat, happily walking my large, incredibly fluffy golden retriever through knee-deep, pristine white snow. The mountain air was breathtakingly cold, wonderfully pure, and entirely untouched by the stench of corporate desperation. I watched my dog joyfully leaping through the massive snowdrifts, a warm, completely peaceful smile resting easily on my face. The chaotic world of corporate greed, flashing red alarms, and desperate men begging for their miserable lives did not exist in my beautiful mountains. While I was peacefully enjoying the freezing winds of the Colorado wilderness, the incredibly tense situation inside the glass walls of the Ethelgard Executive Conference Room had finally reached its absolute, catastrophic breaking point. The blaring emergency alarms and flashing red strobes had drawn the undivided attention of every single high-ranking executive from both organizations. Julian Vance was slowly marched back into the main meeting room by two highly intimidating security contractors from Vanguard Health. His previous arrogant swagger was completely gone. He looked exactly like a dead man walking to his own execution. His expensive cashmere sweater was totally ruined by cold, nervous sweat, and his hands were shaking so violently that the heavy silver flash drive rattled loudly against his ring as he was forced to place it directly onto the polished mahogany table. He had absolutely no choice left. He was entirely cornered. The chief executive officer of Vanguard Health, an incredibly powerful man who personally managed billions of dollars in global assets, sat at the head of the table, his arms tightly crossed, demanding immediate transparency. Elena Rostova did not offer Julian a single word of comfort or hesitation. She reached out with her steady, uncompromising hands, picked up the silver metal drive, and firmly inserted it directly into the primary port of her encrypted auditing server under the intense, watchful eyes of the entire senior leadership team. The entire room collectively held its breath. For exactly 3 seconds, the massive projection screen remained a glaring, blinding red. Then, with a loud digital click that echoed sharply through the silent room, the defensive firewall I had built instantly recognized the physical key. The red emergency lockdown screens violently shattered into thousands of digital fragments. In their place, a terrifyingly clear, incredibly detailed dashboard materialized, broadcasting my absolute final masterpiece directly to the audience. The screen did not just display boring, abstract lines of code. It instantly pulled up exactly 4,217 authentic, completely unedited medical patient records. The auditing software automatically highlighted the horrific discrepancies in bright yellow. On the left side of the screen, the executive saw the actual clinical blood test results, showing massive critical indicators of severe liver and kidney failure. On the right side, they saw the heavily manipulated, totally sanitized outputs that Marcus had manually forced the diagnostic artificial intelligence to generate. It was undeniable. Mathematical proof that their revolutionary medical device was explicitly programmed to completely ignore fatal warning signs just to falsely pass federal safety benchmarks. But my algorithm was not finished. Raw data can sometimes be debated by expensive defense attorneys, so I had made absolutely sure to completely eliminate that possibility. A secondary window aggressively popped open directly in the center of the massive projection screen. It contained high-resolution screenshots of heavily encrypted, highly confidential internal messaging chats between Julian and Marcus. The system timestamps proved these conversations happened less than 48 hours before they fired me. Elena read the messages aloud to the frozen room, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Marcus," she read from Julian's account, "I do not care if the algorithm is missing the organ failure rates. Hide the anomalies. Bury the data. We have a $500 million acquisition on the line. Just hit the launch deadline." The room grew so incredibly quiet you could hear a pin drop. The projection then displayed Marcus responding, "If we hide this, the machine will misdiagnose actual human patients. People will absolutely die." Julian's final damning reply was plastered across the screen in massive text. "Fix the interface to look clean. I am not losing this deal over your sudden moral panic." Before anyone could even process the sheer sociopathic horror of those messages, the digital ghost I had planted initiated its final, most devastating sequence. My software had been silently running an automated legal compilation script. It rapidly gathered every single falsified patient record, every hidden chat log, and every bypassed safety protocol, instantly formatting them into a highly professional, fully cited, comprehensive legal document. It projected a completely finished, perfectly drafted legal brief right onto the screen. It explicitly detailed exactly how Ethelgard Biosciences was actively committing massive, coordinated investor fraud, deliberately violating federal health regulations, and recklessly endangering countless human lives for extreme financial gain. I had not just exposed their crimes, I had essentially done the federal prosecutors' jobs for them, wrapping the entire criminal conspiracy in a perfectly neat digital bow. The chief executive officer of the Vanguard Health conglomerate had seen more than enough. The older man stood up so abruptly that his heavy leather chair slammed violently into the glass wall behind him. His face was pale white, deeply contorted with a terrifying mixture of pure rage and absolute horror. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Julian, who was now weeping openly at the table. "This entire deal is completely dead," the Vanguard executive roared, his furious voice shaking the glass panels. "We are pulling all of our funding, canceling the acquisition immediately, and officially severing every single tie with this fraudulent organization. You are completely finished. Vance?" The atmosphere in the room completely froze. It was a suffocating, terrifying coldness. Julian physically collapsed forward, his head hitting the solid mahogany table, sobbing uncontrollably and stammering completely incomprehensible words. He had just watched a $500 million empire instantly vaporize into thin air. At that exact moment, the fragile alliance between the two criminals completely shattered. Marcus, realizing he was about to spend the rest of his natural life in a maximum security federal prison, violently turned on his boss. He jumped out of his seat, aggressively pointing at Julian and screaming at the top of his lungs. It was all him. He forced me to write the bypass code. He threatened to ruin my career if I did not manipulate the trial data. I am a victim here. You have to believe me. I was just following his direct orders. The pathetic, cowardly blame shifting echoed miserably off the walls, a perfectly fitting end to their toxic partnership. Elena completely ignored the screaming men. She did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She turned sharply to the Vanguard corporate legal team standing directly behind her and issued a series of rapid, uncompromising orders. Seal every single door in this building. Nobody leaves, and nobody touches a single keyboard. Cut the external network access immediately. She then pulled her mobile phone from her tailored jacket, dialing a highly secured number while the massive screen was still glowing with the undeniable proof of their crimes. Get me the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and patch in the primary investigative branch of the Food and Drug Administration. We have a massive, active corporate fraud and a severe public health emergency to report. The trap was fully shut, and the absolute destruction of Ethelgard Biosciences was now completely irreversible. Exactly 48 hours later, the entire global financial ecosystem woke up to the absolute, highly spectacular destruction of Ethelgard Biosciences. The massive corporate fraud scandal instantly exploded across the front pages of every major international newspaper and dominated the leading financial news networks, down in the sweltering heat of Austin. The carefully sanitized, pristine corporate reality was violently shattered. A massive fleet of dark tactical vehicles belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation aggressively swarmed the campus. Heavily armed federal agents marched directly through the sleek glass lobby, entirely ignoring the frantic protests of the corporate legal team. Julian Vance and Marcus Thorne were forcefully dragged out of the front doors, their wrists locked tightly in heavy steel handcuffs. The arrogant executive who had just graced the covers of business magazines was now crying openly, his face pale and completely terrified as the flashing cameras of ruthless investigative reporters captured his absolute, permanent humiliation for the entire world to witness. The mighty $500 million valuation of the company did not just drop, it evaporated into absolute zero overnight. Furious, deeply betrayed investors immediately filed dozens of massive class action lawsuits, permanently guaranteeing that my former bosses would be spending the next several decades locked away inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. While their entire world was violently burning to the ground, my encrypted mobile phone gently rang. I was sitting quietly on the heavy wooden porch of my secluded mountain cabin, wrapped warmly in a thick blanket. The caller identifier indicated it was Elena Rostova. When I answered, her voice was remarkably different from the cold, ruthless, and terrifying auditor she usually portrayed in corporate boardrooms. She spoke with a tone of deep, genuine awe and absolute professional respect. She spent several long minutes highly praising my flawless architectural design, my undeniable brilliance, and my uncompromising ethical standards. Finally, she formally offered me the highly coveted position of Senior Vice President at Vanguard Health. She promised a massive 7-figure annual salary, limitless corporate resources, and complete creative control to build their new, heavily regulated, ethical medical artificial intelligence division. I sat perfectly still in my heavy wooden rocking chair, silently watching a brilliantly vibrant orange and purple sunset slowly dip behind the jagged, snow-covered mountain peaks. The crisp, freezing wind brushed softly against my face, carrying the fresh scent of pine trees. I listened very patiently to her grand promises of immense wealth and unparalleled corporate power, letting the profound, beautiful silence of the Colorado wilderness completely swallow her frantic words. "Thank you for the incredibly generous offer, Elena," I replied. My voice was remarkably smooth, incredibly soft, yet as unforgiving and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "But you fundamentally misunderstand the situation. The reason I encrypted that system and built that trap was absolutely not to score points with Vanguard Health. Nor was it an elaborate resume to secure a lucrative job at your massive corporation. Exactly 2 weeks before your auditing team even arrived in Texas, I personally mailed an independent, fully decrypted physical copy of that exact same flash drive directly to the Criminal Investigative Division of the United States Department of Justice. The rot has been completely cleared out, and I simply do not work for people who have to wait for a computer program to point out exactly where the ethical boundary lies." I gently pressed the red button to end the call and casually dropped the phone deep into the pocket of my heavy winter coat. I picked up my large ceramic mug with both of my hands, taking a slow, incredibly satisfying sip of my steaming hot jasmine tea. I looked out over the vast, silent, heavily snowed valley, leaving the frantic, screaming, totally chaotic world of the modern technology industry infinitely far behind me. The absolute most devastating revenge had been entirely completed, and I had successfully crushed a massive empire of lies into absolute dust without ever raising my voice even a single time. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to today's story. We truly appreciate every single one of you being here with us. Please let us know in the comments exactly where in the world you are listening from today. As we mentioned earlier, if you found today's journey captivating and want to actively support our continued work, please consider joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. You will gain immediate access to our very best, highly detailed, exclusive true stories featuring incredibly emotional voiceovers that we simply cannot publish on this platform anymore. You can join us right now by scanning the code on your screen or by clicking the link provided in the video description and the pinned comment below. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day, and stay strong.